My name is Gervais Dupuis. I am 79 years old. I worked for 31 years as a road crew surveyor and then as a site foreman for the Provincial Roads Department, most of that time in the BC interior. And I am telling this now because Odette died on the 14th of March, which was 8 weeks ago today, and she made me promise that if she went first, I would speak what I know into a recording device and give the recording to our daughter Simone so that Simone would have it when I am also gone. Odette said that a person has a right to know the full shape of the night they came into the world. She said this 3 days before she died in the hospital room in Kamloops, with the mountain light coming through the window the way it does in March, pale and thin, barely committed, and she held my hand when she said it. I have been carrying the words of that night for 53 years. I did not find them difficult to carry, not most of the time, because what I witnessed was not a thing of fear but a thing of such unusual grace that carrying it felt less like a burden than like holding a bird in cupped hands, alive and warm, and knowing that if you opened your hands too wide it would be gone. But Odette is gone now, and the promise I made her in that hospital room is the last promise of hers I have to keep. So I am sitting at the kitchen table in Clearwater with this small recorder that Simone's boy Theodore brought me at Christmas, and I am beginning. The year was 1957. I was 26 years old. Odette was 24 and 8 months along, and we were living that summer and fall in a canvas and frame cabin on the south edge of a road camp above the Alouette drainage, not far from the foot of Mackenzie Pass. The camp was a provincial roads operation, 12 men and 3 families in residence, placed there to carry a surveyed line through to the next valley before the first hard frost closed the pass. I had been hired that spring as the junior surveyor, which meant I was responsible for the preliminary measurements and for keeping the stakes true, and the work was long and physical, and I loved every day of it. Odette had come with me from her parents' farm outside Barrière because she was not a woman who stayed behind, and she had made a home of that canvas cabin that was as particular and deliberate as any house I have ever lived in since, with the pots arranged by size on the nailboard, and the stovepipe checked every morning, and a chair she had dragged from the supply shed placed beside the south-facing window, where she sat in the afternoons and waited for the light to change over the ridge. She was practical in the specific way of women who have grown up in country where the weather can decide your whole year for you, and she was calm about the pregnancy in the same way, treating it not as a crisis approaching, but as a piece of work that would come due in its own time. The foreman of that camp was Felix Cowett, a wide-shouldered man from the Saguenay country who had been building roads in the BC interior for 20 years by then, and who knew the mountains the way a person knows a difficult relative, with patience and without illusion. Felix was 53 that year. He had lost his first wife to a fever in 1941 and had never remarried, and he ran the camp with the quiet authority of a man who has nothing left to prove and no audience he cares to impress. He is gone now. He died in 1974 in Quaysnel, and I never told him what I am about to tell you, Simone, because he did not ask, and the men of that generation did not ask questions they suspected would change them in ways they had not chosen. The cook for that camp was Paulette Archambault, a large-framed woman of 45, with a broad, watchful face and hands that could carry 2 cast-iron pots at once without trembling. Paulette was from a farming family near Verdun who had followed a husband to the BC interior and then outlasted the husband and stayed on because she said the mountains suited her temper. She is also gone. She died in 1989, and I have thought about her every year since because she was the first person I told when I came down from the pass on the morning of the 22nd of October, and the way she received what I told her was the reason I trusted the world to hold what I was carrying. She listened without interrupting, and then she said quietly and without any dramatization, "I have heard of such things." She said nothing more. She made me sit down and eat, and she did not ask me again. The other man I need to name is Norbert Vaillancourt, who was the camp's equipment operator, and the person who came looking for me with the lantern when I did not come back the night of the 21st. Norbert was 38, a compact and careful man from the Bourse country who was largely silent during working hours and precise in everything he did with his hands. He found me at the edge of the lower survey line at 4:30 in the morning, and he said only, "Dupuis, you are all right?" And I said yes, I was all right. And he looked at me for a moment in the lantern light, took in the state of my clothes and my face, and whatever he could read in my expression, and he said, "Then let us go down." He never asked me what happened on the pass. He died in 2003, and I am grateful to him. I want to tell you precisely how it began, Simone, because precision is the only thing I have to offer in place of proof. It was the evening of the 21st of October, 1957. The temperature at the camp by Paulette's thermometer was 4 degrees above zero, which was warm for that elevation and that date, though there was a bank of cloud moving in from the northwest that Felix had watched at supper and said would bring weather by morning. I had gone up to the pass after supper to check 3 survey stakes that I was concerned had shifted during the week's blasting, and I had meant to be back before dark. The trail up from the camp was not a trail in any wilderness sense, but a rough cleared line through lodgepole, pine and spruce, marked at intervals with orange flagging, and I had walked it 40 or 50 times by that point in the season, and knew every section of it. I took a hand lantern and a compass and the survey notebook, and I told Paulette I would be back for the last coffee. What happened is not complicated to describe. I checked the first stake, which was sound, and the second, which needed redriving, and I drove it again with the mallet I had brought and noted it in the book. The third stake was an additional 40 minutes up the slope, in a section of the survey line that ran along a shelf of exposed granite above the tree line, and by the time I reached it, the light had gone very quickly, and the cloud had come in lower than Felix's prediction, and the visibility on that shelf was perhaps 15 feet in any direction. The orange flagging on the return line was invisible in the mist. I had the lantern and the compass, and I began to come down, but the shelf has no clear descent except by the survey line itself, and I had drifted west of the line in the dark and the mist, and the slope I was following was wrong. I knew it was wrong within 20 minutes of descending. I stopped. I took a compass bearing and established that I was approximately 200 meters west of where I needed to be, on ground that fell away steeply to the northwest, and I began to work my way back east along the face of the shelf. I am telling you this in detail, Simone, because I want you to understand that when I encountered what I encountered, I was not confused or delirious or frightened to the point of imagining things. I was cold and I was off route, and I was concentrating very carefully on my footing, and the lantern was burning low, and I had the specific focused attention of a man who is in a technical problem, and working it methodically. When the lantern went out, I sat down against the rock face and waited for my eyes to adjust, and in the quiet that followed, I became aware that the mist had a sound to it, a low, resonant sound that I first took for wind passing through a crack in the granite above me, and then understood was not wind, because it had an internal structure to it, a movement, almost a phrase, that repeated twice, and then changed by a half tone and repeated again. I did not move. I had been in the mountains long enough to know that a still and attentive man is harder to disturb than a moving one, and I was still. He was there before I could see him. I am going to tell you what I mean by that. The temperature on that shelf changed. It changed specifically the way a temperature changes when a large warm body is close to you in the cold. Not a general warming, but a direction of warmth from my left side. And it came with a smell that I can only describe as bark and deep soil, and something else I have never found a word for. Something old and close, and without any threat in it. I could feel his breathing before I saw any outline of him in the dark, and the breathing was low and very slow, lower and slower than a man's breathing at rest, and each exhale carried that sound again, the low tonal phrase, different now, shorter, more measured. He was not alarmed. He had known I was there before I knew he was. When my eyes had been in the dark long enough, I could see his outline against the slightly lighter grey of the mist. I want to tell you exactly what I saw. He was very large. He was standing on 2 legs on the granite shelf, not 4, and the outline of his shoulders was at least 4 feet wide, and his standing height was somewhere between 8 and 9 feet, which I did not measure then, but confirmed in my own mind later by placing him against the granite face at my back, which I had already measured in the survey work, and knew to be 9 feet at the point where I was sitting. His arms were proportionally very long, hanging at his sides, and his head was large and sat low on the shoulders in a way that made me understand, even then, that the shape was not human, not anything I had a file for, and yet there was nothing in it that made me want to move away. I have tried to explain this many times to myself across 53 years, and I have not done it satisfactorily. What I can say is that the quality of his attention toward me was the quality of attention I have felt from a very old and patient animal, from the specific kind of creature that has been alive so long it has no remaining interest in theatre. He was not performing stillness. He was simply still. We were on that shelf together for what I believe was 3 hours, though I cannot prove this from any clock. At some point in the first hour, he settled. I do not mean he sat down. I mean the quality of his attention settled, like a sound that has been held at a high register and is let down to a lower one, and he moved very slowly to a position roughly 4 feet to my left, close enough that the warmth from him was continuous and definite. The cloud did not lift. The mist did not thin. He stayed. I stayed. At some point I slept, which I did not intend and cannot fully account for, and when I woke he was still there, still in that same low-register stillness, and the mist was beginning to show the specific quality of grey. That means the darkness is receding rather than deepening. He made the tonal phrase once more, 2 iterations of it, and then he stood to his full height, and I could see more of him in the growing pre-dawn light than I had been able to see in the full dark. The face I will not describe in detail, because I have never found a description adequate to it, and because I do not want the inadequacy of my words to diminish what I actually saw, which was old and calm and aware of me specifically, aware of me as this particular man, in this particular difficulty, on this particular shelf of granite, not afraid, not aggressive, simply present. He turned and walked to the east end of the shelf, which was the correct direction for the survey line, and he stopped there. He did not gesture. He simply stopped, and when I followed and stood beside him, I could see the first orange flagging stake 5 meters below, exactly where it should have been. I came down to the camp at 4:30 in the morning, as I said. Norbert met me at the lower line with the lantern. I went in, and Paulette was awake, and I sat at the table and told her what I have just told you, in the same quiet way, and she said what she said about having heard of such things, and she made me eat. Then she said, "Odette," and I said, "Yes, what about Odette?" And Paulette said in a different voice, a careful voice, "Gervais, Odette's light was burning most of the night." I went to our cabin and found Odette sitting up in the bed with the lamp on, and her face the colour of good pale birch, and I understood immediately. And I went to her and she said, without raising her voice even slightly, "I believe the baby is coming now. I believe she has been coming since about 10 o'clock last night." That was 12 hours. Simone, you were 12 hours along in this world when I found your mother sitting up in the dark in that cabin, waiting for me to come back. And she had not woken Paulette or raised any alarm, because she had not wanted the whole camp to know before I knew. Paulette came. Felix went on horseback in the pre-dawn dark to the nearest telephone, which was at the forestry station 9 miles down, to reach the doctor in Lillooet, who said he could not get through the pass until the weather lifted, and to keep the woman warm, and tell me what he told Paulette. The doctor did not reach the camp until midday. By midday you had already been born, Simone. Paulette delivered you at 7:43 in the morning, by her own watch, which she wore on a cord around her neck. You weighed, by the camp's hanging scale, which was a rough instrument, between 9 and 10 pounds. You were very dark, darker than Odette or I could account for, with a great deal of fine, dark hair and eyes that in the first hours were not the unfocused eyes of a new infant, but specific and fixed and already measuring something, though I could not have said what. Paulette washed you and wrapped you and placed you in Odette's arms, and she looked at me over the top of your wrapped head, and she said nothing. She did not need to say anything. We both understood something without either of us being willing to name it. And in fact, we never named it directly. Not in the 12 years Paulette was still part of our lives. Not at Christmas cards. Not in the one letter she sent after she moved to Quesnel. What passed between us on that morning was the kind of understanding that does not require language, and that language would only diminish. I want to tell you what you were like as a small child, Simone, because the truth of a night can be measured partly in what grew from it, and what grew from that night is you. And I want to be precise. You were not strange in the way that word usually means. You were not difficult or frightening or outside the ordinary measures of a child's development. You walked at 9 months and talked at 11 months, and you read before you were 4. And your teachers, all of them, said the same thing in different words, which was that you were entirely present in a way that most children are not, that you attended to things with a quality of concentration that was not anxious, but simply thorough. I thought of that shelf. I thought of that particular quality of attention that had been directed at me in the dark, the quality of a very old and patient animal that has no remaining interest in theatre. You were never theatrical. You were never performing. Even at 4 and 5 years old, you had the quality of a person who is simply there, fully there, and aware of things at the edges of a room that other people do not notice. You were always close to animals. I do not mean you liked animals in the way children usually like animals, which is a kind of excited ownership. I mean that animals were calm around you in a specific and unusual way, a way that Odette and I noticed independently and discussed once, quietly, in the kitchen after you had gone to bed, one evening when you were about 7. The dog we had then, a red tick hound named Berard, was an old and arthritic animal who rarely moved from his place by the stove, but he followed you everywhere in the house and lay down exactly where you lay down. And when you went outside, Berard went outside, and on the 2 occasions, when you walked to the edge of the woodlot behind the house and stood at the tree line, which you did sometimes in the evenings without explanation, Berard sat down at your left side and was completely still, the way he was never still otherwise, and watched the dark between the trees with the same quality of patient attention you gave it. Odette saw this once from the kitchen window. She came to find me in the workshop, and she said, very quietly, "Gervais, come and look at this," without saying anything. I looked. You were standing at the tree line in the early dark with Berard at your left side, and both of you were still, and the dark between the trees was simply the dark between the trees. But after perhaps 2 minutes, you raised one hand, slightly, in a gesture that was not a wave and not a signal, but something more private than either of those things, a small acknowledgement directed at something I could not see. And then you turned and walked back toward the house with Berard beside you. I have thought about that gesture for 53 years. We moved from that camp the following spring to a permanent post in Clearwater, where I had been offered the foreman position on the road maintenance district. The camp above the Alouette drainage was decommissioned 3 years later when the survey line was completed and the pass road opened and the canvas cabins were taken down and the cleared ground went back to alder and willow in a decade. I drove past the access road once, in 1968, and there was nothing visible from the road that indicated anything had ever been there. The mountains do not hold the shapes we put on them. You grew up in Clearwater, Simone. You were a quiet child, and then a quiet young person, and you went to the normal school in Kamloops, and came back with a teaching certificate, and taught at the elementary school on the east side of town for 22 years. You married Théodore Bergeron in 1985, and you have Théodore's boy, also Théodore, who is now 20, and who has your quality of attention and your patience with animals, which I have always noted without comment. You have lived a life that the world would describe as ordinary, and I have always understood that the world's description was incomplete, not wrong, but partial, because the ordinary surface of a life does not show you what is underneath it, which is a quality of presence that does not belong entirely to the human side of things, and that I believe came to you from that night on the pass, through a chain of connection I cannot trace precisely and will not pretend to explain. I need to tell you about the winter of 1961, which was 4 years after the night I have described, because what happened that winter is part of the full shape of the story, and Odette always said it was the part that confirmed what we had not been willing to speak aloud. We were living in Clearwater by then, You were 4 years old. It was the 12th of January, and there had been heavy snow for 3 days, and the temperature had been holding at -22 by the back porch thermometer. I was working the late shift that week, which was not usual for me, but the district had a road emergency on the highway south of town, and I was not home when it happened. Odette told me every detail of it that evening when I came in, and she told it to me with the precise and careful diction she used when she wanted to make sure I understood that she was not exaggerating and was not frightened and was not asking me to do anything except listen. You had been put to bed at 7, as usual. Berar, who was then 11 years old and mostly deaf and nearly blind, was sleeping at the foot of the stairs. At approximately 9 o'clock in the evening, by Odette's account, Berard woke and went to the back door, which he had not done in months, and stood there without barking, which was itself unusual, because Berard was a hound by breeding and barked at everything in his younger life. Odette went to the back door and looked out through the glass. The porch light was on, and the yard was deep in snow, and the temperature outside was, as I said, -22 degrees. At the edge of the yard, where the fence ended and the open slope began, there was a figure. Odette described it to me carefully and without any excitement in her voice, which was her way of telling me that she was entirely sure of what she had seen. Very large, standing upright, dark against the white of the snow, with the porch light sufficient to show the outline and the face, at a distance of perhaps 30 meters. He did not move. He stood at the edge of that yard in the cold and the snow and the dark, and looked at the house for a time that Odette measured at approximately 10 minutes, and she stood at the back door and looked back at him, and neither of them moved. And then very slowly, without any haste or alarm, he turned and walked into the open slope and was gone into the dark. Berar, at her feet the entire time, made no sound and had not moved. Odette said, "He came to see the child." She said this without sadness and without excitement, and without any indication that she thought this required debate. She said it the way she said things she had thought about carefully and arrived at with conviction. I did not argue with her. I have never been a man who argues with what he has seen, and what Odette had seen was specific and clear, and she was not a woman given to embellishment. I said, "I think you are right." And she said, "I know I am right." That was all. We did not tell you, Simone, because you were 4 years old and the information would not have served you. But Odette kept it, the way she kept many things, in the part of herself that was private and precise, and did not require an audience. There was one other event I need to record. It was in the summer of 1965, when you were 8 years old. We had driven up to the Clearwater Valley campsite for a week in July, the three of us, and on the third morning you woke before we did, and were gone from the tent when Odette and I woke at 5:30. This was enough to alarm us both, because you were not a wandering child. You were careful, and you understood the rules of the back country, and you had never done anything like this before. We found you 20 minutes later at the edge of the campsite, on the bank of a small tributary creek, where the trees came down close to the water, standing with your back to us, looking into the trees, with Berar, who was 15 by then, and almost certainly dying, sitting at your left side, in the exact posture I have described before. You turned when you heard us, and your face had the expression I can only call complete, the expression of someone who has just received something they had been waiting for, without knowing they were waiting. You said, "Dad," There was something there, I said, as carefully as I could. I know. You looked at me for a long time, the way you looked at things you were measuring. Then you nodded and came back to camp for breakfast. I do not know everything that passed between you and the forest on those mornings at the Treeline, Simone. I never asked because I understood that asking would be a kind of intrusion, and because I believed, and I still believe, that what you were given on those mornings was not mine to measure or catalogue. You belong to both sides of the threshold, the warm side and the cold side, the lit side and the dark side. And that is not a deficit, and it is not a wound, and it is not something that required fixing. I want to be very clear about that. Your mother was clear about that from the first hour of your life, and she never wavered, not once in the 53 years that followed. She loved you with the full and specific love of a woman who has looked at something larger than she, expected and accepted it without requiring it to become smaller. Odette and I talked about the night on the pass, the two of us, in depth, exactly twice in our marriage. The first time was when you were 7, and Odette had seen you at the Treeline with Berard. She said to me that she had known, from the moment she understood that the baby was coming and that I had not come back, that the night was connected, that what happened to me on the pass and what was happening in the cabin were not separate events. She said she had lain in the bed through 12 hours of labor in the dark and the cold, and she had felt, not imagined, not wished, but physically felt, a quality of presence at the window of the cabin, something very large and very still outside in the dark, and that the quality of that presence was not threatening, but constant, the way a particular sound is constant, and that she had not been afraid, and had not called for help, and had in fact been calmer through those 12 hours than she had any reason to be. She said, "I believe he was there the whole night," I said. "I believe he was there too," she said. "I believe he knew." I have thought about what she meant by that word. Knew for 53 years, and I have not found a more exact word. The second time we spoke about it, in depth, was 2 years ago, when Odette's first diagnosis came back, and we were sitting in the Kamloops waiting, room with the information still very new between us, and she took my hand and said, "When I go, you need to tell Simone about the night she was born, all of it." "Everything," I said I would, she said. "She has a right to know the full shape of the night." I asked her if she thought Simone would want to know, and she said, "Gervais, she already knows. She has always known something happened. We are only going to give her the words for what she already carries." I believe Odette was right about that. She was right about most things that mattered. Paulette Archambault died in 1989, as I said. She left a small estate including a letter addressed to me, which her executor forwarded. And the letter contained 2 sentences of relevance. I was not surprised by what I saw that morning in October 1957. "I have kept many things in my life, and I intend to take this one with me, except that you should know you were not the first person to come down from that pass with that look on your face." She did not elaborate. I have honored her discretion by not speculating about what she meant, because I do not know what she meant, and she did not want me to know, and the people who take their knowledge to the grave are not failing in their obligations. They are exercising a form of sovereignty over their own experience that I respect entirely. What I want to say to you directly, Simone, is this. You are not a damaged person. You are not a mystery to be solved. You are not a question with an outstanding answer. You are a woman who belongs to 2 worlds, the human world and the larger world that presses against it from the tree line. And you have always managed that belonging with more grace than I would have managed it, more grace than I think I could have managed it at your age or at any age. What came to you from that night on the pass, through whatever chain of connection I cannot name precisely, was not a diminishment, and it was not a contamination, and it was not anything the world ordinary language has a word for. I know what I saw on that shelf of granite. I know what your mother felt in the cabin through those 12 hours. I know what you looked like at 4 years old standing at the tree line with Berar at your left side. I know what your face looked like at the tributary creek in 1965 when you turned back from the trees. I do not know what it means, and I have never pretended to know. And I think the not knowing is the honest and correct position, and I think the attempt to know would be the wrong kind of question, the kind of question that shrinks the thing it is trying to understand. I told Felix Cowawet none of this, as I said. He died without knowing, and I am certain that was the right choice. I told Norbert Vaillancourt nothing beyond the bare fact that I had been lost on the shelf and found my way down, which was true as far as it went. The other men in the camp that year noticed nothing and asked nothing. Only Paulette knew, and Paulette, as I have said, took her portion of it with her when she went. Odette carried all of it from the first hour, and she carried it with the competence and the dignity of a woman who has looked at something larger than the frame and accepted that the frame needs to be larger. I carry it now. You carry it in the way you have always carried it, in your posture at the tree line, in the quality of your attention, in the way old Berard followed you, and the way the animals Theodore's boy brings home are calmer than they should be, in the specific and unmistakable quality of presence that your teachers and colleagues have been trying to describe for 50 years, with words that are not quite right, because the right words are not in the ordinary vocabulary. I am sitting at the kitchen table in Clearwater. It is a May evening, and the light on the mountains to the east is the particular gold that May makes in the BC interior, long and slant and not quite resolved, and the wood stove is cold, and the coffee is finished, and the small recorder is still running. I am going to stop speaking in a moment. I want to say one more thing, which is that I am not sorry for any of it. I am not sorry for being lost on that pass. I am not sorry for the night. I am not sorry for the thing that waited with me on the granite shelf in the dark, and the cold and the mist, and then walked me back to the line and the flagging. I have thought for 53 years about what that night was, and I have not found an answer, and the absence of an answer has not troubled me, because the thing I carry from it is not a question. The thing I carry from it is you, Simone, standing at the tree line in the early dark, with your left hand slightly raised, and Berard still beside you, the two of you looking at something I could not see, and that I understand now I was never meant to see, because it was not looking for me on those evenings. It had come to look at you. It was checking, the way very old and patient things check on the ones they have particular reason to watch. And the checking was gentle and sufficient, and required nothing from you but your presence there at the edge of the lit world and the dark one. The world is more full than we knew. Odette said that to me in the last week of her life, and I believe she was not saying it for the first time. I believe she had been holding that sentence for a long time and was giving it to me to keep. I am giving it to you now. The world is more full than we knew, And the things that move in the large dark between the trees are older than our names for them, and more careful with us than we have any right to expect. And I have been a lucky man to know this from the inside. And you have been born into it, which is a different and more particular kind of luck. And I hope you have always known it as luck, even on the mornings when it was heavy, even in the years when the weight of belonging to two worlds was a weight you carried, without asking us for help, which you always did, which was your mother's quality and hers alone, and which I admired without ever being able to match it. The recorder is still running. I am going to let it run for one more moment, and then I am going to stop it and take it to the post office and send it to you in Kamloops. And that will be that. That will be the full shape of the night. I hope it is enough. I believe it is enough. Your mother believed it was enough. She said so.